In the decades before the American Civil War, the U.S. Army was a busy one. The main role of the Army was to help explore and hold territories across the vast western frontier. I say territories because many of these areas had not even achieved statehood yet. The push west also led to an armed conflict with Mexico in the 1840s. Several prominent generals in the American Civil War gained invaluable experience as junior officers in the Mexican War. This included Robert E. Lee, George Meade, Ulysses S. Grant, James Longstreet, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. The U.S. Army in the decades before the American Civil War was a small one. It contained less than 8,000 soldiers that were mostly scattered across the vast western frontier. This was a far cry from the Union Army in the American Civil War, which at its height reached a total of 700,000 soldiers. With tensions on the rise, the U.S. government took some steps in the years before the Civil War to increase the size of the Army. But even at the outbreak of the war, there were only 16,000 soldiers, with many still scattered in remote frontier posts. So when the first state, South Carolina, seceded on December 20th, 1860, the U.S. Army was in no position to do anything about it, let alone protect military assets in the secessionist states. This situation was made even worse by President James Buchanan, who merely protested but took no action. Without any clear direction from Washington, the undermanned and ill-equipped U.S. Army troops were left to fend for themselves against much larger Confederate forces. As a result, a chaotic scene ensued, with secessionist state militias seizing equipment and forts with almost no resistance. In his memoirs, William Tecumseh Sherman described the chaos. In 1859, Sherman had accepted a job as the first superintendent of Louisiana State Seminary of Learning and Military Academy, which today is known as Louisiana State University. Sherman was in charge of several professors and cadets. As superintendent, Sherman reported to the governor of Louisiana. Anticipating that Louisiana's Ordinance of Secession would be passed in late January of 1861, Governor Thomas More ordered the state militias to start seizing all U.S. military posts. Sherman writes, quote, "On the night of January 9th, about 500 New Orleans militia, under the command of a Colonel Wheat, went up from New Orleans by boat, landed, surrounded the arsenal at Baton Rouge, and demanded its surrender. Commander Joseph Haskin was, of course, unprepared for such a step. Yet he at first resolved to defend the post as best he could with his small force. But Braxton Bragg, who was an old Army acquaintance of Haskin, had a parley with him, exhibited to him the vastly superior force of his assailants, embracing 2 field batteries, and offered to procure for him honorable terms, to march out with drums and colors, and to take unmolested passage in a boat up to St. Louis, alleging further that the old Union was at an end, and that a just settlement would be made between the two sides for all the property stored in the arsenal. Of course, it was Haskin's duty to have defended his post to the death. But up to that time, the national authorities in Washington had shown such weakness that the officers of the Army knew not what to do. The result, anyhow, was that Haskin surrendered his post, and at once embarked for St. Louis. The arms and munitions stored in the arsenal were scattered, some to Mississippi, some to New Orleans, some to Shreveport, and to me, at the Central Arsenal, were consigned 2,000 muskets, 300 Jagger rifles, and a large amount of cartridges and ammunition. Thus I was made the receiver of stolen goods, and these goods the property of the United States. This grated hard on my feelings as an ex-Army officer, and on counting the arms I noticed that they were packed in the old familiar boxes, with the U.S. simply scratched off." End quote. Shortly after this, Sherman sent a letter to the governor of Louisiana, resigning from his post and headed back north. The flashpoint and start of the American Civil War came at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Fort Sumter at the time was considered to be one of the strongest forts in the world, even though it was still unfinished at the time. Fort Sumter was built as a result of British naval forces capturing and occupying Washington during the War of 1812. It was part of a system of U.S. fortifications designed to protect American harbors from a naval invasion. Construction started in 1829. By 1834, a timber foundation had been laid. However, soon the decision was made to build a much stronger fortification, made of brick and mortar. The fort had 5 feet thick walls and stood at a height of 50 feet. It was designed to house 650 soldiers and 135 guns in 3 tiers of gun emplacements. The fort was still not completely finished in 1861 because of budgetary limitations. South Carolina was the first state to secede, and considered the heart of the secession movement. After South Carolina seceded, the authorities there believed Fort Sumter was the property of the state. President-elect Lincoln believed that it was still the property of the United States, and did not recognize the authority of South Carolina or the Confederate States of America to claim the fort. Shortly after South Carolina seceded, Governor Francis Pickens ordered his state troops to seize federal positions around Charleston Harbor. On December 26th, Union Major Robert Anderson moved his garrison from Fort Moultrie to the stronger Fort Sumter. State troops then quickly occupied Fort Moultrie, Fort Johnson, and the battery on Morris Island. Anderson was effectively cut off, surrounded, and holed up in Fort Sumter. President Buchanan was not happy that Sumter was garrisoned by Anderson, but nonetheless he decided that the fort would need to be resupplied by sea. Originally, the plan was to send a warship, but this was thought to be too provocative, and the Navy was not sure they could even get a warship close to Sumter. And so a merchant ship, named the Star of the West, was hired to resupply the fort. The ship approached Charleston Harbor on January 9, 1861. As it approached Fort Sumter, it was fired upon by the artillerymen on Morris Island. Batteries from Fort Moultrie opened fire too, and the Star of the West was forced to turn back. After this, the fort was on its own, and faced dwindling supplies and rations. In March, Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard took command of South Carolina forces in Charleston. President Jefferson Davis had appointed him to take command of the siege. Beauregard demanded several times that the Union forces either surrender or withdraw. After Major Anderson refused time after time, Beauregard took additional steps to make sure that no supplies reached the fort. Anderson never wavered in his loyalty to the Union, although he was a native of Kentucky and a former slave owner. Abraham Lincoln assumed the presidency on March 4th, and made it quite clear to his cabinet there would be no deal to hand over Fort Sumter. A month later, Beauregard ordered the bombardment to begin at 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861. A single mortar round was fired from Fort Johnson. This was the first shot of the American Civil War. And with that, the general bombardment began from Fort Moultrie, Fort Johnson, and several other surrounding batteries. Anderson had 60 guns at his disposal, but because of a lack of manpower, he could not utilize all of his cannons. Fort Sumter had never been designed to conduct a battle against land forces. It had been designed to fight warships whose cannons would likely be out of range of the fort. Worse yet, the Confederate land-based cannons could target the interior of the fort, which was constructed mainly out of timber, while the outer walls were constructed out of bricks. The heated cannonballs caused huge fires to engulf the interior of the fort. Luckily for Union forces, a rain shower extinguished the flames. The next day, however, the rain stopped, and the Confederates again began to fire heated mortar rounds into the center of the fort. The wooden buildings caught on fire, and there was concern that barrels of gunpowder would explode next. To prevent this, Union soldiers dumped the barrels into the ocean. With almost no ammunition left, there was nothing left to do but surrender. Amazingly, there were no casualties suffered during the 34-hour-long bombardment. Union soldiers were allowed to withdraw and head back north. Anderson's only condition was that he be allowed to perform a 100-gun salute to the U.S. flag. This was granted. During the salute, a pile of cartridges blew up from a spark, mortally wounding Privates Daniel Huff and Edward Galloway. They were the first military fatalities of the Civil War. Major Anderson carried the Fort Sumter flag with him to the north, where it became a symbol of the battle and the war for Union supporters. Fort Sumter remained in Confederate hands for almost the entire duration of the war. During this time, the Union conducted major assaults against the harbor and fort. The fort was reduced to essentially a pile of rubble by 1863, with the upper levels totally blasted away. This is a picture of the fort after the devastating bombardment from U.S. Navy ships. 4 years after lowering the U.S. flag in surrender, Anderson raised it in triumph over the recaptured but badly battered Fort Sumter. Today, Fort Sumter is a National Historic Landmark. The lower portion of the wall survived mostly intact because the upper portion of the wall collapsed on top of it, giving it protection against Union naval bombardment.